Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to UCL and this lunchtime lecture. I'm Paul Eakins, and I'm Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy here at the Institute for Sustainable Resources, and it's my pleasure to be chair of this seminar. The event is part of UCL's climate campaign called Generation One, and that arises from the fact that we believe we are and need to be the new generation taking responsibility for climate action and turning science into actionable ideas. And of course, it's highly symbolic that this lecture is taking place at the same time as COP26, and we wish everyone up there all the best in arriving at the very strong deal that they need to reach. So please welcome, and you can join Generation One in a number of easy ways. You can pledge your climate action. You can find out more about it at ucl.ac.uk/Generation One and choose what action you will pledge and inspire others by sharing your pledge on social media or tweeting from this event using the hashtag hashtag UCL Generation G1 capital O and no space between the words. The second way you can use it is to check out our new Generation One podcast series, with the first episode launching on the 3rd of November, which of course is tomorrow. So details of that are on the website. So to the substance of today, we've got three great speakers. We're going to start with Nadia Ameli, who's a Principal Research Fellow at the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources, and her work focuses on economic, finance, and policy aspects of climate change and related energy issues. And she's been working since her PhD on questions related to the financial barriers of low carbon investments, and was recently awarded an ESRC starting grant focusing on the role of climate finance to meet the Paris goals. And she'll be followed by Dr. Joshua Ryan Collins. He's head of finance and macroeconomics at UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And his research interests include money and banking, sustainable finance, and the economics of land and housing. He's written a number of books, including Where Does Money Come From? And Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing, and Why Can't You Afford a Home? So pretty important stuff. And he's published in a number of journals, as you would expect. He was previously senior economist at the New Economics Foundation. So I'm going to start with them to start with, and then we'll introduce Ashish when he joins us. So Nadia, over to you, and please kick off with the first of the talks in our seminar. How could fairer finance help us address climate change? Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. It's really my pleasure to be here today. Part of the presentation today, part of the work is really related about how we can mobilize investments for the low carbon transition. And the one angle that I like to take is what this really means when it comes to developing markets, developing countries. The talk I'm going to give today is based on one of our recent analyses that have been just published in Nature Communications. So if you'd like to read more details, please check our last analysis. And the paper is really about how basically it's difficult to mobilize investment in developing markets, and especially African nations. Before we go into more details about really the studies, I just want to show you the challenge that we face today in terms of climate investments. The chart, the blue line, really shows us where we are in terms of climate finance mobilized over the year. And then if you see the green area, it's where basically the amount of investment needed to meet the targets. You can see that despite there has been a positive trend, an increasing trend over time, we are still quite away from what is needed to meet the 1.5 degrees. The range of estimates is pretty large because it's based on IPCC different models, but definitely we need to move billion to trillions, and we are still quite away from the target. The picture is even more complicated when it comes to the investment flows and how they are distributed around the world. Here you can see really where most of the money went, and you can definitely see three major areas, which are North America, Western Europe, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia, East Asia and Pacific, with China literally playing a bigger role in these areas. But there are other continents and other parts of the world where it's much more difficult to mobilize finance, to mobilize investment. And in particular, if you look at the African continent and the size of the continent and the level of investments is pretty low, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Africa. And that's really what those trends are telling us, is that really the country context, it's really critical in determining investments, because really the capacity to mobilize funding is really linked to the local and everyday environments. So I'm talking here about the macroeconomic conditions, the policy stability, the business confidence that investors, they do have when it comes to investment. And the way those factors are basically factored in investment decision is really in terms of what are the risks that investors need to face when invest in a country context. So a key sort of variable that capture those perceived investment risk, it can be the cost of capital. The cost of capital is simply a financial measure that tells us basically the expected return that an investment has to have in order to invest in a given country, in a given context, given also the kind of risks that investors will consider when investing. And this measure is really critical in understanding really how basically decarbonization pathways can be or can look like in the future. So we do need to take into account those costs of capitals in our assumption. And in our analysis, really, we try to show how those decarbonization pathways differ when the cost of capital is considered at a local level, at a regional level. And again, just here to show you a little bit of picture on how it looks like the cost of capital around the world. Here, this is a sort of simplified version of the world. You can see there are some macro regions, and it reflects mainly the region in our modeling exercise. But what is striking is that there is a huge difference across countries in terms of cost of capital. You see areas of the world like Europe where it's pretty low, it's around 4%, in other areas where it's actually pretty high. And in particular, you see in Africa that it reaches about 12% the cost of capital, and this is even an average value, because when we zoom into a single country, then you have huge differences. There are countries like Congo, Zimbabwe, where the cost of capital reaches 30%, and that's because those are some of the riskiest areas in Africa. And other countries within the continent where the cost of capital is slightly low, like Morocco, South Africa, where as I said, the macroeconomic conditions are slightly better compared to Congo or other countries. And why this is so really important, and that's something also we theorize in our analysis, it's this idea of a potential climate investment trap in developing countries. It builds a little bit on the concept of the poverty trap, which is again an idea of when a country is so poor that cannot escape the poverty trap. And here we're facing a very similar situation, and where a climate investment trap occurs, where climate investments remain chronically low. And that's because it's due to a set of self-reinforcing mechanisms that are set into place. And here the way we sort of theorize this climate investment trap. When you think about developing countries, as I showed before, they do already have a higher cost of capital compared to Europe or North American or other developing markets. This is already a disadvantage because it's much more difficult to mobilize climate investment. That means that you have worse climate impacts that further impact the economy of the country in terms of low production, high unemployment, high instability. And again, the country is even perceived with higher domestic risk, and usually also those countries that do have underdeveloped financial markets. And again, it's a loop where you will increase again, the risk premium to invest in a given country that fell back to an higher cost of capital. And that's a sort of, again, trap that we see in developing contexts where it's very difficult to mobilize capital and the cost of capital can just increase over time because we are not taking action. We now just want to really give a flavor of the relevance of those aspects. And we briefly present some key results from our analysis. It's really, here those are the results for the African continent. And here we compare what are the real impact of the cost of capital, this 12% cost of capital, compared to a global value, so an average value. Most of the modeling exercise, they just assume there is another rate which is equal and uniform across the globe. In our case, in Africa, we do have to pay 12% interest rate when we want to invest there. And the difference with a global rate would be quite striking. Again, with the global scenario, we get much more electricity because investments are cheaper, the capital is cheaper. We do about more emission for the same level of investment. If you compare the red line and the blue line, we do have the very similar investment level, but we just achieve less when we consider the real financing cost in Africa. Another interesting, I would say, result, it's about what we can estimate in terms of effects on the cost of capital if we would introduce basically policies that can reduce the cost of capital. So what are the effects on investments that we can get? And here we try to understand what are these effects of reducing the cost of capital that in Africa is 12%. And let's assume that it goes down to this uniform value, the 6%. And let's assume again that this result is achieved in a sort of fast scenario, so by 2050, or it's reached over the century, so by the end of this century. And again, the results are quite relevant because the faster we reduce the cost of capital, the more we get more green electricity. So we get 40% more compared to the baseline scenario. And of course, this comes with a higher level of investment behind. But I would say that the even most important results is in terms of emission reduction. So if we reduce the cost of capital, net zero emission in Africa will be achieved much faster by 2050 compared to the REG scenario, so in 2058, sorry. And that means we gain almost 10 years compared to the baseline scenario. So again, early actions is really important because it helps us to reach net zero much faster than in normal condition. I try to think about then what are the channels to influence the cost of capital in developing countries. And of course, the first channel is through the private capital markets. So we need to make sure that financial markets, the private money goes in developing markets. But when we look at the current financial markets and the current sustainable finance frameworks, we can see that they are not really designed for developing countries. There is a strong focus now on low carbon assets, but there is no mention of the target countries. So it seems that the current sustainable frameworks are more developed for development markets like Europe or North America rather than developing countries. For instance, the EU Sustainable Finance Plan, that I would say it's one of the most ambitious one, it doesn't really include any references to developing context. And even the ESG approach, ESG stands for the environmental social governance approaches and the risk approaches, somehow really penalize developing markets. Developing markets are much more riskier countries. It's where the physical risks are felt most, are also, they don't perform well if you think about the social governance criteria. So they are somehow penalized by those approaches that are now quite developed in the current sustainable finance frameworks. Another channel is then through the public development finance. This is, I would say, the most used channels. So public institutions, development banks that are investing in developing markets can even play a stronger role by providing long-term capital and access to low capital, and can try to foster local markets, for instance, by supporting the growth of the green bond market. And the last entrance in the picture are more the central banks and how we can use financial regulation to really improve access to finance in developing markets. And again, here the action should be focused on lowering the cost of capital and really underwriting risks in order to rebalance this risk-return profile of investments in developing countries. Just really some final remarks before I stop. I would say that really developing economies are incredibly impacted by the cost of capital rates. Our analysis shows that we do need to act to improve access to finance, because this would have a huge impact on the speed and the timing of the transition. We can really speed up the transition to net zero by 10 years, for instance, in Africa. The current finance framework are not really taking into account those aspects, in particular the country dimension. So if we want really to avoid those climate investment trap, we need to trigger their investment and improve access to finance. I think, especially now after the COVID, we do have an opportunity to reframe international market finance. I want then to close with a quote from a former World Bank president, Jim Yong Kim. And it's really about when we don't see capital going somewhere, and here he mentioned in particular the private capital, then we really need to ask ourselves, what are the conditions that are really hampering those investments? And if the conditions are not right, then we do need to de-risk projects, sectors, and think even about entire countries. I think I'm stopping here, and I'll thank you everyone and look forward to the question.
Well, thank you very much, Nadia, for that. And of course, it answers a question which I've had in my mind for some time, which is that if you look at the analyses of IRENA, the International Institute for Renewable Energy, they're frequently saying that renewable energy is now as cheap or not cheaper than, or cheaper than fossil fuels in many countries, including developing countries. And yet we're not seeing the investment into those countries. And clearly the points that you've identified might provide us something with an explanation of that. So let's turn then to our second speaker, whom I've already introduced, and we'll go to Josh Ryan Collins. Before I do that, let me just tell you that if you want to ask some questions, please do so via Slido. So you simply Google Slido and call that up. And the event code, which you will need to enter in order to get into our part of Slido to ask your question, is #UCL in uppercase and then climate in lowercase. So that's if you want to put in some questions, because we will have time for questions at the end. But for now, let's go over to our second speaker, who is Josh Ryan Collins. Josh.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for everyone who's attending today. I'm going to talk to you about finance, land use change, and the environmental transition. I'm going to talk really about the financial system itself, and the way in which I think it's a driver of environmental degradation. So a bit of political economy mixed in there with my analysis. But the first point I wanted to make really was just I guess in a way to pick up on what Nadia was saying towards the end there. The current sort of framework for that financial regulators and central banks are focused on is with regard to the role of finance in climate change and environmental transition, is to think about the risks that the transition poses to the financial system. So they have a very much a sort of risk-oriented analysis. Now, the main way they're thinking about it so far, although this is changing, if you look at this slide, is to focus on what's called the financial materiality. So that what's happening is the financial system is lending or funding harmful business activities that are degrading the environment. Those business activities will have to change. There'll have to be a transition for us to reach net zero and reach our biodiversity targets. and that will lead to stranded assets held by those financial organizations holding those assets, those loans, or that equity. And central banks are focusing more on how to reduce that risk. So, for example, by asking banks to hold more capital against particular types of loan. But there's another type of risk, and that is the risk caused by the financing of harmful business activities directly onto the environment. So that's this second loop here. And this is what you might call environmental materiality. And it's this that I think we need to start thinking about more seriously, because the destruction of the environment can lead to systemic macro financial risks to the whole economy. The loss of biomes, key biomes such as rainforest, arboreal forest, can lead to tipping points, which lead to systemic changes in the natural state of these systems, which can lead to climate change and pose systemic threats to economies. But there's been rather less attention to the financial materiality that these biophysical risks can create. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is that the areas in the world where these key biomes, areas of enormously important biodiversity, biodiversity rich areas, are mainly in developing or emerging market economies rather than in advanced economies. So we have this sort of natural capital asset, which is key to the functioning of the Earth system, held in economies which are growing and need to grow in order to reach the levels of welfare that we're used to in high income economies. And of course, the sort of global economy and the global financial system is set up in such a way that the only way at the moment they can achieve that level of growth is by basically destroying those natural capital assets. Now, this goes back a long way, but essentially, because the Industrial Revolution arguably was based on this type of system, the UK Industrial Revolution, for example, there's an academic paper which shows that the UK absorbed 7 times its own sort of planetary resources in going through the Industrial Revolution by importing resources from all over the world, including slave labor, of course. So it's not a new thing, but it continues to this day. And there's been a sort of burst of analysis quite recently, burst of academic work recently, pointing out that peripheral economies, particularly developing countries, specialize in this extractive and pollutive industries, found typically at the beginning stages of value production, whereas the core high income economies tend to consume the majority of global resources, but they don't suffer from the social and environmental costs, the floods that we've seen, the desertification that we're seeing in parts of Africa and other places. And of course, they don't get the same returns because when they export the goods that have been manufactured using those resources from developing countries, they tend to get a much higher return because they're coming in at the end of where there's higher value to be added at the end of the production process. So there's some analysis here showing that between 95 and 2015, all regions except high income economies were net providers of raw materials, with their production exceeding their consumption. Now, I want to just focus in on an analysis of this, looking particularly at the agricultural finance nexus, agri-finance as it's called, because I think whereas in the Industrial Revolution, you clearly had countries like the UK and the European countries sort of physically going in and asserting their colonial empires and physically grabbing resources from other countries, including slavery, etc. Today, it's a bit more subtle, but a similar kind of dynamic is occurring, and it kind of comes through the global trade, but also the global financial system, which is set up in such a way as essentially to support this extraction process from the periphery to the core, and finance lies at the heart of this. So some analysis shows that top 50 global banks provided almost 400 billion of loans in equity and underwriting services to the agricultural sector around a fifth of which is associated with biodiversity loss, recent analysis. And it's not just banks, but also big institutional investors, including passive asset managers such as BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, are strongly associated with holding very large blocks of equity in the Brazilian Amazon, for example. This is some analysis done a few years ago by Galas et al. So these companies have potentially very significant influence in stopping these kinds of investments and activities, usually done by quite large multinational agri-food companies. They're highly consolidated firms spread all over the world. So that's one way in which finance degrades the environment. But there's another way, which is we've seen agricultural land increasingly become seen as an alternative financial asset over the last sort of 15, 20 years or so. This is partially, I think, due to sort of collapsing interest rates on other forms of safe assets, such as government bonds, which investors would typically invest in. So land then becomes more attractive because it's a relatively safe asset. You can't hide it, tends to appreciate in value over time. You can secure capital gains and rents from it. And of course, if it's used for food production, you can secure rents directly from the farmers farming the land. So there's some research that shows around almost 50 million hectares, which is about the size of Spain, of large-scale land acquisitions for agricultural purposes were conducted by foreign investors between 2000 and 2014, mainly, again, in the global south, especially Africa. And this chart by a paper by Altaf Ashish Ghadiali and co-authors shows you the net flows of large-scale land acquisitions, essentially. So the red nodes and the red flows show imports. So you can see the United States and Europe importing huge amounts of effectively buying up land in these countries for use, mainly for agricultural purposes, whereas developing and emerging markets essentially selling that land. And these are the dynamics that continue to this day. Now, this is problematic because, as I said, the incentives for financial investors in land tend to be towards exploiting that land and maximizing profit upon it. And this tends to run against the preservation of biodiversity and the maintenance of high carbon stocks, for example, in rainforests. So typically, there's a conversion of what's called underutilized land for more commercial purposes, intensive agriculture being the obvious one. Typically, the addition of infrastructure, which damages biodiversity, can lead to wholesale land use change and habitat fragmentation. Typically, if you want to maximize commercial land productivity, you have to have the enforcement of land titles and consolidation of land, which tends to exclude indigenous communities who may have decades of experience in how to preserve land in its more biodiverse format and have small scale, less damaging farming practices. And typically, to maximize commercial value, there's a preference for cash and flexible crops for export. You probably know the guilty candidates: soy, beef, coffee, sugar, these kinds of cash crops, which leads again to large-scale industrial farming practices. And in terms of scalability, own and lease out models and agricultural land securitization are the preferred models by investors. So they're not actually managing the land themselves. That tends to be outsourced. And this leads to less transparency around who actually owns the land and who's responsible for looking after it, which can mitigate against sustainability disclosures. And of course, disclosures is what financial authorities are trying to get banks and and companies to do. The task force on nature-related financial disclosures. There's a similar one now on biodiversity, but it gets more and more difficult with this kind of sort of complicated financial instruments and arrangements around things like agricultural land. So what can we do about this? For me, the obvious alternative is to focus a bit less perhaps on de-risking investment, and focus, certainly in high income economies anyway, and focus a bit more on the regulation to reduce ecologically damaging financial flows. And there's plenty that central banks and financial supervisors can do. Most obviously, they can force banks to hold more capital against damaging lending, but they could also align monetary policy. So quantitative easing should be aligned with the risks posed by transition risk and physical risk posed by climate change and biodiversity loss. And there could be introduced exclusionary policies on, for example, financing that leads to the loss or degradation of rainforests and other such biomes. This is standard practice for large companies and ESG frameworks. There's no reason that central banks should not be adopting similar kinds of policies. And then on the sort of global financial architecture level, what could we do to try and mitigate some of those ecologically unequal exchanges that I talked about at the beginning? Well, one interesting concept is the idea of nature-based sovereign bonds, and these would essentially enable developing countries that owned biomes or very biodiverse rich land to issue debt linked to the preservation of those natural capital assets. So if those assets were being preserved or expanded, the interest rate would be linked, the interest rate would fall or at least not rise. In contrast, if damage was taking place, the return to the investor would rise. So you'd have a sort of state contingent liability, which could encourage and sort of bring the right incentives together for both lender and investor. It's very early days with this, and there's a lot of challenges to make it work, I think, but it is one interesting way forward. You have, for example, inflation-linked bonds that are issued and have been quite successful. There's no reason we couldn't link sovereign debt to other forms of positive outcome. And what we've seen with the COVID crisis, of course, is the debt or in developing countries rising massively, and the cost of borrowing, particularly in other currencies, rising massively. And that brings me to the second point, really, which is this idea of ecologically linked special drawing rights. Now, special drawing rights are issued by the International Monetary Fund, and they're essentially a supplementary reserve asset, and they're determined as a weighted basket of 5 major currencies, and they're essentially a way to enable countries to boost their foreign exchange reserves. And they're particularly useful for countries which find it difficult to borrow in foreign countries, typically dollars or yen, for example. And recently, the IMF did make a $640 billion issue of special drawing rights. And it was trying to encourage high-income economies to transfer some of their SDRs to developing countries. But what would be even more interesting would be to rethink the issuance of these special drawing rights according to the natural capital that different countries actually own, as a way, again, of encouraging them to preserve those natural capital, and essentially recognizing that globally we need to preserve these kinds of assets. I'm probably running over my time a bit, but some implications for policymakers, I suppose, is to think about financial values and incentives and practices and the system more generally, and how currently it's in this very extractive type of mode, and the need to reform institutional relations connecting macro financial and sociological systems. And that there's not a lot of transparency, particularly in an area like agri-finance and land at the moment. I would argue that policy interventions need to move beyond this sort of market fixing focus on prices, and think about the types of interventions that would prevent us reaching these ecological tipping points beyond which we're facing catastrophic losses. And those are not really subject to market incentives or market shifts. I think there needs to be a bigger role for the state in shaping those markets. And the financial system, I think, could play a key role. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Josh. And thanks for that. And it makes me think that we heard at the COP, obviously, that 100 or so countries have signed something saying they're going to stop deforestation. Well, the sorts of things we've been hearing from Josh will be what they will actually need to do in order to go beyond these kind of statements that they're going to do, make these commitments by 2030. So we are now going to move to our third speaker. Welcome, Ashish. This is Ashish Ghadiali. He's an activist in residence at the Sarah Parker Remond Center at the Institute for Advanced Studies here at UCL. He's a filmmaker and an activist who organizes with the climate justice collective Wretched of the Earth. So I think we know where he's coming from. He's a member of the coordinating committee of the COP26 Civil Society Coalition and a commissioning editor at Lawrence and Wishart Books, where he's developing a new soundings imprint to be launched with a slate of books on race and ecology in 2022. So I'm going to go over to you, Ashish. Before I do, just I've noticed there's some questions come in the Slido. That's great. Keep them coming, please. And we should have 5 to 10 minutes at the end just to tackle these. So over to you, Ashish.
Thanks so much, Paul. And thank you for that introduction. I mean, I think it's important to clarify that I'm not, the context from which I'm speaking is not that of a kind of a researcher. It is my background is as a grassroots activist. I've kind of, I've worked in communities, often in marginalized communities, looking at questions of power and representation. And I've kind of come into the discourse around climate very much from that perspective, and actually have come into residency at UCL also from that perspective, and thinking about the kind of about the field of climate research and its impact on climate action more broadly, through the prism of justice. I guess where that work where that perspective has kind of brought me is to a sense of really what is kind of grossly lacking in the contemporary intergovernmental discourse around climate action, and I think that focusing that on issues around climate finance is kind of fruitful, because I mean, if we, so for example, since the G7 summit earlier this summer, we've seen that the kind of headline kind of call to action from the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but from kind of the most powerful world leaders in general, has been to call on the richest countries to meet the $100 billion climate pledge, which is, as a headline in itself, quite often does succeed in dominating media headlines and sounds like an appropriate call to action. But I think it's really important that we recognise how that we acknowledge the full context in which pledges such as this are coming forward. Namely that it's the renewal of a pledge that has essentially failed to the meeting of which has sort of failed to happen since it was first made at Copenhagen at COP15 in 2009. So during which time we've seen both global temperatures rise. So we're now fast approaching average atmospheric temperatures of 1.2 degrees, and and as a result of that, we've already lived through a decade of hugely increasing climate impacts. The costs of which are borne not by the countries or not borne most emphatically by the leaders of by the citizens of G7 nations, but by Black and brown people who live on the front lines of climate breakdown, mostly in the global south. So it remains very much a question of racial equity. And during this last 10 years, for example, the costs of climate-induced loss and damage alone. So when we talk about $100 billion, a $100 billion a year pledge in climate finance, we're talking about budgets that would be split, well, that would be largely within the kind of current framework focused on mitigation. That's attempts to that's sort of approaches to decarbonize the Earth's atmosphere. That money that would be spent split between mitigation and adaptation to the growing impacts of climate breakdown. The reality within which that delayed pledge is now being discussed is one in which the costs of climate-induced loss and damage alone have risen in excess of $150 billion a year. So at the level of governance, I think that it really does need to be acknowledged that the discourse that we're seeing grabs so much resource and so much media attention right now in Glasgow, it is wholly inappropriate. I mean, you know, to talk of coming good finally on a $100 billion a year pledge when we are in which the question of loss and damage is not actually being addressed amounts to sign off on a climate deficit, and that is a deficit the burden of which will fall on those who are least responsible for climate breakdown and also least resilient in the face of the effects of climate breakdown. So I think that it's useful to go a step further in understanding what the contemporary intergovernmental discourse around climate finance amounts to, and that is the sign off on a kind of projection of what UN experts, the UN Special Rapporteur has described as a future defined by climate apartheid, plunging 120 million people in. I think that's a low estimate, and I guess it's in light of that I kind of I think that we need to be looking really significantly beyond the decarbonisation agenda that is kind of characterised by, for example, the UNFCCC's Race to Zero campaign that is kind of dominating discussions in Glasgow over the next fortnight, and that we really need to start to move beyond the kind of paradigm that Josh has sort of described of kind of a growth-based climate action agenda, and start to proceed towards I guess what I can only understand really as a justice based paradigm.
Okay, thank you, Ashish. A passionate call there for climate justice, which one hears often, and one hears many people saying that it should happen, but at the moment it certainly isn't. And like you, I share your concern that well over 10 years after that 100 billion was first mooted, all the best we've been able to come up with is yet more years of delay. So that is really concerning. Okay, so let's go and visit Slido and have a look and see what questions we've got. We have got quite a few questions. So I'm going to start by asking Nadia a question that came straight out of your presentation. What is it that drives the cost of capital in developing countries, and why is it much higher than in developed countries?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, it really relates about the condition, the working, the environment and enabling factors that are in a country. Our analysis has showed basically that the cost of capital is really driven by the country risk factors. So basically, investors, what they're interested in when they lend money, it's really, what's the appropriate return that I can get in investing in a specific project in a given country. So if I can invest in a solar plant in Africa, rather than in Germany, how much more I should ask in terms of return to compensate for the risks. And really what drives the risk is the local context, is those macroeconomic conditions, the policy stability, the currency risk. So when that was also touched a bit by Josh, when you're investing in developing countries, there is a strong currency risk there. There is quite, volatility is very high. And, on top of the project risk, you need to add also this currency risk. There is also a lot about corruption, governance, policy stability. So I think all those really factors that can be summarized in the macroeconomic condition that are linked to a specific country are the main drivers. And those aspects, they do influence the business confidence that investors feel and perceive when investing in a project. And as I said, there are countries like Japan and Germany where they're really perceived as a safe country. So the cost of capital doesn't go up more than 3%. As I say, there are countries in Africa where it goes up to 30%. And that really reflects those macroeconomic conditions that you do have in the country.
Okay, thanks, Nadia. And I'm very struck, thinking to something that occurred in Josh's framework, that as these developing countries are hit harder and harder by climate change, those risks are going to go up. They're not going to go down. And that therefore, left to themselves, those costs of capital are going to go up even further. So expecting those countries actually to attract the investment is going to become increasingly challenging. Let's go to a question for Josh here, which relates to something you said about central banks, Josh. So officials at central banks believe technology will mitigate climate change. Where does this view come from? Is it realistic? Do you think it's going to happen?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the questioner means by technology, but I do think that central banks have put quite a lot of faith in markets to solve these problems. And you can see that really with the very strong emphasis the regulators have put on this idea of the disclosure of climate risks or carbon related risks. There's a whole sort of terminology around it now, and most famously Mark Carney advocated this approach with the task force on climate related financial risks. And the idea of this really is that the problem is that it's not, markets aren't very good at pricing the risk, and they're not very good at understanding it and putting a price on it, which would enable investors to then sort of realize the risk, and then prices would adjust for a smooth transition. Now I've written quite a lot about why this is problematic, and the main reason it's problematic, I think, is because what you're talking about with climate change and the green transition and biodiversity loss is not really risk, but it's actually uncertainty. So in a sort of Keynesian sense of fundamental uncertainty, whereby you really have no idea, you can't even assign a probability to a set of different events. And that's the standard approach that financial risk uses. It typically looks at previous occurrences of things and then assigns a probability based on that. With climate change, we're talking about tipping points, we're talking about changes in state which we've never seen before. So it's not possible to assign that kind of quantitative estimate of the risk. And this means we can't rely on the market, in my view. I mean, to some extent, we can use the market, but the market needs to be guided into the areas to support, and even more importantly, to stop financing what are clearly unsustainable forms of activity.
Right. So obviously a pretty fundamental role there for central banks. A question to you then, Ashish, if I may. And the questioner has asked, what can we expect from COP26 to improve access to finance, and I guess particularly to those developing countries that currently don't see as much of it as they should? And perhaps I can add my own question to that is, and what do you think that climate justice actually demands from COP26 in order to improve access to finance?
I mean, I think if the question is specific to COP26, I mean, I at this stage in proceedings, I don't have a huge amount of my energy sort of directed towards COP26. I think that there was time for those conversations earlier in the year. I don't think that conversation. I mean, the crucial arena for progress on climate justice within the COP arena is loss and damage, which it isn't on the agenda as something that will be advanced significantly. A lot of the intention around that is kind of focused around the Santiago agreement. It's a contentious issue, and it's seen as what kind of has led to sort of divisions at Madrid, and it seemed to be the kind of the issue that can divide COPs. So I mean, I think that, and that it would be. I think that the fear, say, within sort of the UK Cabinet Office, or where kind of organising has kind of preceded this event in the UK over the past 24 months. There's a kind of fear that it opens Pandora's box, and that we might then find ourselves, kind of being forced to acknowledge responsibility for historically rooted inequalities that go back centuries. I mean, I guess the issue is that it might, and if we do actually want to proceed, if we do want to participate as British citizens, as UCL academics in a sustainable and just future, we might need to look harder at difficult questions. So, I mean, for my money, what we need to be doing is radically looking at COP26's failure to address the issues that could actually seed a pathway towards ecological equilibrium. I don't think that's on the table yet at all, and I think that the perspectives that both the research that Josh is describing and Nadia's work point to very, very important failings of the current paradigm. For me, the work begins as soon as this COP's over. How do we actually start to address its failures, which are already written in stone, as far as I can see, and start building. Over how do we make sure that we actually get ourselves on a kind of a reasonable path of global governance over the years and the decade ahead?
Okay, well, thanks very much, and certainly, like you, I think the action really has to start after COP26. When I first heard all the various targets that have been put in place, I was quite excited because it was an advance on where we had been before. But I must say, I don't need any more targets for 2050. I actually need some action on Monday morning that along the lines that either Nadia or Josh have said, that is actually going to show how we're going to sort this out in ways that meet the scale of the problem. So let's go back. Well, why don't I give just a quickie to both Nadia and Josh on this finance stuff? Do you agree with Ashish that basically on the finance stuff, COP has failed and we need to see what comes out afterwards, or do you reckon there's still something to play for there? Nadia.
Thanks. Well, something that I really would like to see from the COP is, especially thinking about the climate pledge of this 100 billion per year, is to add something to those quantitative targets, I mean, this is more a volume target, like, okay, we need to mobilize this 100 billion. But again, if we look at the empirical evidence at the capital flows today, we see that actually very little is going to the most vulnerable country. Even these financial flows mobilized to developing markets are going to some of the usual countries with somehow some prospect for growth, but they're not going to the most vulnerable one. I mean, they're not going to Africa, for instance, or some very difficult countries, context in Africa. So I think part of the pledge needs to include this country dimension if we want to see this transition more globally. So next to the 100 billion target, we need to include also the country dimension, because as I said, financial markets are not designed for developing countries. The sustainable finance frameworks are not taking into account those contexts. And so the hope will be that those international climate pledges or agreements can take it.
Okay, I'm not aware of anything on the agenda that's going to do that, but that might be again something to really focus on afterwards. Josh, over to you. What are you expecting or hoping for from COP on the finance side, apart from this 100 billion?
Yeah, I feel like the 100 billion's become something of a red herring, I have to say. I think it's not the quantity of finance, as Nadia was alluding to, I think, but the quality of it. And I think we haven't seen enough support really for developing countries to develop their own financial and fiscal space and capability. I think that's key. We need to find ways of relieving debt, for example, of financial mechanisms, as I was saying in my presentation, that incentivize these countries to preserve their natural biodiversity assets and be able to actually make money from the preservation of those assets. But even more importantly, I think for high income economies, there needs to be less emphasis on more money going into, complicated projects all over the world, which may or may not support the transition, and more emphasis on stopping finance going into damaging ecological activities. And there's a lot of scientific consensus over the types of activities that are clearly damaging, rainforest deforestation being probably the most obvious one, but there's many others. And there are international agreements around these things. But the financial system remains quite wedded to, instead of just, or financial regulators seem to be very wedded to market solutions, which do not actually just stop this kind of financing from happening. So I think it's, in a way, it's a call for simplicity. We used to just prevent banks from lending for things that we thought would be damaging. Even banks in the 1950s and 60s were not allowed basically to lend for mortgages, which were seen as leading to house price appreciation and speculation. You had things called credit guidance, quantitative limits on the types of lending that banks could be done. All of this sort of was thrown out in the sort of neoclassical, neoliberal revolution of the 70s and the 80s with this belief in the power of the market to allocate more efficiently. I think we need a sort of fundamental revisiting of that kind of approach. So I would sort of call for just more simple regulation and prevention of damaging financial flows.
Okay, and I think we've just got time for one more. Thanks, Josh. Just one more question. This comes from Pedro Garcia, who really enjoyed the session. And this is a question to Nadia. What role does incorporating impact-weighted decision-making frameworks play in reducing capital costs for impact investing? So that's the kind of investing that is has a wider frame of return than just a financial return. Nadia, can you manage that in a minute?
I try. Well, I guess that's really the way. I mean, and that's the impact that we want to expect. Try to rebalance this risk-return profile, take into account other factors, or where it's a public institution or financial regulators or central banks, as again, Josh was saying before, can step in, takes part of the risk and eradicate the risk and rebalance this basically return risk profile. And that would be really the way to do it if you want to mobilize. It's really part of the saying, can we make the condition right for finance to flows in the assets we want to see more investments?
Right, well, I think there's a fair bit of agreement across the piece here that actually the market's left to themselves and not, A, they're not doing what we need done, and B, they can't and won't do what we need done. So there is a whole range of interventions that are going to be necessary if we're to get both the finance flowing in the right direction, but also anything approaching climate justice. So Ashish, thank you very much for your very eloquent putting that concept on the table. That's it. We have come to the end of our time. This isn't the last of these seminars, so the next one is going to take place on Thursday, the 4th of November, so just a couple of days' time. And that is going to be on a very, very different topic, which is how do we manufacture personalized machines? I'm sorry, how do we manufacture personalized medicines, not machines, medicines, although very much same kind of thought of scientific development that's much more individually focused. That's going to have the speaker, Dr. Kazim Rafiq. So do come, same time, I guess same place isn't relevant as we'll be online, and see you then. But for now, thank you very much to my speakers, Nadia Ameli, Ashish Ghadiali, and Josh Ryan Collins, for a really interesting seminar on one of the most important topics facing COP. And as Ashish was keen to stress, the post-COP period, which is when actually these pledges are going to have to be turned into real action. So thank you very much, and cheerio for now.